talk about Lincoln, as long as you give him a little credit. Do you think he was just thinking of the white man?
Lincoln, according to history, stated that if he could stop this so-called Civil War without freeing the slaves, he would. If he could save the Union by freeing the slaves, he would. He wasn't interested in freeing the slaves, sir. According to history, Mr. Lincoln was interested primarily in saving the Union. And today, many so-called Negroes who don't read into the history or into the points of history that aren't included in the general history books take Mr. Lincoln as their friend. But if he set them free, why are they still begging for civil rights? To me, civil rights means citizenship. If a man doesn't have civil rights, he's not a citizen. There's no
Do you have civil rights, Mr. X?
No, sir. There's no such thing as second-class citizenship.
Mr. X?
We feel that if after 100 years since Lincoln issued the so-called Emancipation Proclamation, if the black man here is still not recognized as a first-class citizen, which means free, then we don't feel that what Lincoln did actually set the so-called Negro free in the first place. Not freedom in its full sense of the word.
Number one, I think it should be pointed out clearly that as Muslims, we are not a political group, nor are we a civic group, but rather we are a religious group. When I say that we're not a political group, it's being made plain there that we are not relying on the politicians for a political solution, because experience has taught us that in the past the politicians have promised but never delivered. And if we rely on a politician, we feel we'll be going right around in circles like our people have been doing here in America 100 years since Lincoln issued the so-called Emancipation Proclamation. If Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation 100 years ago, which means we're supposed to be free, we're supposed to be citizens, we're supposed to be protected by the Constitution that we fight and die for, and yet at the same time today, the so-called Negro is knocking at the White House door, still begging his master to pass legislation that will give him recognition or protection by the Constitution that he is supposed to represent him. I think, sir, that the man who is depriving him of these rights cannot open up his mouth and say that it would be war. It would be wrong to go to war against him to get these things. One white man named Lincoln supposedly fought the Civil War to solve the race problem, and the problem is still here. Another white man named Lincoln, again the same white man, issued the Emancipation Proclamation to solve the race problem, and the problem is still here. Some more white liberals came along with the 13th, 14th, and 5th Amendments, which were supposed to solve the race problem. The problem is still here. 9 years ago, 9 more white liberals, so-called, came up with what they call a Supreme Court desegregation decision, and the problem is still here. And then another white man named Kennedy came along running for president and told Negroes what all he was going to do for them if they voted for him, and they voted for him 80%. He's been in office now for 3 years, and the problem is still here. When the police dogs were biting black women and black children and black babies in Birmingham, Alabama, that Kennedy talked about what he couldn't do because no federal law had been violated. And as soon as the Negroes exploded and began to protect themselves and got the best of the crackers in Birmingham, then Kennedy sent for the troops. And there was no, he didn't have any new law when he sent for the troops when the Negroes erupted than he had at the time when whites were erupting. So we are within our rights and with justice, with justification, when we express doubt concerning the ability of the white man to solve our problem, and also when we express doubt concerning his integrity, concerning his sincerity. Because you will have to confess that the problem has been around here for a long time, and whites have been saying the same thing about it for the past 100 years, and there's no nearer a solution today than there was 100 years ago.
Why, Jesus himself prophesied, "You shall know the truth, and it shall make you free." Beloved brothers and sisters, Jesus never said that Abraham Lincoln would make us free. He never said that the Congress would make us free. He never said that the Senate or Supreme Court or John Kennedy would make us free. Jesus, 2,000 years ago, looked down the wheel of time and saw your and my plight here today. And he knew that the tricky High Court, Supreme Court desegregation decision would only lull you into a deeper sleep and the tricky promises of the hypocritical political legislation would only be designed to advance you and me from ancient slavery to modern slavery.
Human characteristics that we find missing in the so-called Negro communities today. And fifth, we want to then examine the other efforts and methods that have been used and are still being used in a futile effort to solve this problem. And last, we then want to offer and explain the solution that God has given to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, which is complete separation and immediate separation of the slave master and his slave. And as Muslims here in America, we regard the condition of the black man here as modern slavery. We don't look upon anything that was done by Lincoln and those people back there as having any effect upon the condition of freedom or enslavement that the black people experienced in those days and time.
I think the speech is late, Minister Malcolm X, but not too late. No pronouncement that was that impressive and forthright from a president of the United States.
No one made a better pronouncement than Abraham Lincoln made 100 years ago, and that still hasn't been put into practice. It's still a pronouncement. Sir?
News media that had begun to take notice.
Abraham Lincoln tricked the so-called Negro into thinking that he was free, and when you read some of the books that were written by the so-called Negro historian J.E. Rogers, one of his books, The Africa's Gift to America, he points out plainly how Abraham Lincoln did nothing but trick the Negro, fool the Negro, and use the Negro, the same as every other politician who has been in the White House has been tricking and fooling and using the Negro as a political football ever since America has been America.
The picket demonstration
are not Negro Americans, citizens.
If they were citizens, you wouldn't have a race problem. If the Emancipation Proclamation was authentic, you wouldn't have a race problem. If the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment to the Constitution was authentic, you wouldn't have a race problem. If the Supreme Court desegregation decision was authentic, you wouldn't have a race problem. All of this is hypocrisy. And it is this hypocrisy that has been practiced by the so-called white, so-called liberal for the past 400 years that compounds the problem, makes it more complicated instead of eliminating the problem.
The Civil War was also fought on this continent, not to free the black slave, as is commonly taught in the white man's schools, but the Civil War was actually fought to preserve the Union, preserve this country, keep it intact for white people. It wasn't fought to set you free. It wasn't fought to give you some kind of emancipation. It wasn't fought to make you a citizen. It wasn't fought to give you civil rights. It wasn't fought because they respected you and loved you as a human being. It was fought out of greed. It was fought out of selfishness. It was fought to keep this country intact for their own white selves.
Historically, in America, the white liberal has been the one always supposedly who had the solution to the race problem. An example, the leading white liberal in American history was supposed to be Abraham Lincoln. He's the one who has been dangled in front of our people as a god who brought us out of slavery into the promised land of freedom. Martin Luther King last year was begging President Kennedy to issue another Emancipation Proclamation. If the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln was authentic and produced the result that it was supposed to, and if it had been sincere, it would have gotten results, then Martin Luther King wouldn't have to be begging for another proclamation and emancipation today. Another time, the white liberals supposedly fought the Civil War to free the slaves, and our people are still slaves, still begging for freedom. Some more white liberals came along with the so-called 13th, 14th, 15th, and other amendments to the Constitution, supposedly to solve our problem. The Constitution has been amended, and the problem is still here.
The worst enemy the Negro has is this white man who runs around here drooling at the mouth, professing to love Negroes and calling himself a liberal. And it is following these white liberals that has perpetuated problems that Negroes in America has. If the Negro wasn't taken, trapped, tricked, deceived by the white liberal, then Negroes would get together and solve our own problem. It was the white liberals that come up with the Civil War, supposedly, they say, to solve the Negro, the slave question. Lincoln was supposedly a white liberal. When you read the true history of Lincoln, he wasn't trying to free any slaves. He was trying to save the Union. He was trying to save his own party. He was trying to conserve his own power. And it was only after he found he couldn't do it without freeing the slaves that he came up with the Emancipation Proclamation. So right there you have deceit of white liberals making Negroes think that the Civil War was fought to free them. You have the deceit of white liberals making Negroes think that the Emancipation Proclamation actually freed the Negroes. And then when the Negroes got the Civil War and they found out they weren't free, the Emancipation Proclamation, they found out they still weren't free. They began to get dissatisfied and unrest. They come up with the same white liberals came up with the 14th Amendment, supposedly to solve the problem. This came about, the problem still wasn't solved, because the white liberals, it's only a political trick. Civil War, political trick. Emancipation Proclamation, political trick. 14th Amendment to this raggedy Constitution, a political trick. Then when the Negroes begin to develop intellectually again and realize that their problem still wasn't solved and unrest began to increase, the Supreme Court, another so-called political trick, came up with what they call a Supreme Court desegregation decision. And they purposely put it in a language. Now, you know, sir, that these men on the Supreme Court are masters of the King's English, masters of legal phraseology, and if they wanted a decision that no one could get around, they would have given one. But they gave their Supreme Court desegregation decision in 1954 purposely in a language, phraseology, that enabled all of the crooks in this country to find loopholes in it that would keep them from having to enforce the Supreme Court desegregation decision. So that even after the decision was handed down, our problem has still not been solved. And I only cite these things to show you that in America, the history of the white liberal has been nothing but a series of trickery designed to make Negroes think that the white liberals were going to solve our problem.
Then you have the type who looks upon himself as part of the majority and you as part of a microscopic minority. And this one uses a different approach in trying to struggle for his rights. He doesn't dare. He doesn't thank you for what you give him, because you're only giving him what he should have had 100 years ago. He doesn't think you're doing him any favors. He doesn't see any progress that he has made since the Civil War. He sees not one iota of progress, because, number one, if the Civil War had freed him, he wouldn't need civil rights legislation today. If the Emancipation Proclamation issued by that great shining liberal called Lincoln had freed him, he wouldn't be singing "We Should Overcome" today. If the amendments to the Constitution had solved his problem, still his problem wouldn't be here today. And even if the Supreme Court desegregation decision of 1954 was genuinely and sincerely designed to solve his problem, the problem wouldn't be with us today. So this kind of black man is thinking. He can see where every maneuver that America has made, supposedly to solve his problem, has been nothing but political trickery and treachery of the worst order. So today he doesn't have any confidence in these so-called liberals. Now, I know most of you all coming in here tonight, you don't call yourselves liberals. Because that's a nasty name today. It represents hypocrisy.
What do you think of Abraham Lincoln?
I think that he probably did more to trick Negroes than any other man in history. Because there's his own where he always, I have read where he said he wasn't interested in freeing the slaves.
He said that, yes.
So he was interested in saving the Union. Well, most Negroes have been tricked into thinking that Lincoln was a Negro lover whose primary aim was to free them, and he died because he freed them. I think Lincoln did more to deceive Negroes and to make the race problem in this country worse than any man in history.
Well, most of our people don't even know the meaning of civil rights, and by not knowing what it is they're actually trying to get, it has eluded us for the past 100 years. Civil rights is supposed to mean citizenship. When you have civil rights, you have citizenship. When you have citizenship, you have civil rights. And if the 22 million Afro-Americans were actually citizens of this country, it wouldn't be necessary to pass any kind of additional legislation to include us in the Constitution. If you notice, whenever the people come here from Europe, they can come here from Poland, which is a communist country. They don't need any legislation to make this Polish person a citizen. They don't need any additional civil rights legislation to make the refugees from Hungary who come here citizens. They don't need any additional legislation to make anyone who comes to this country a citizen. But when it comes to the rights of the black people who are the descendants of slaves, then immediately new legislation is necessary. So this right here implies that when the Constitution was written, in some way or other, it must have excluded those of us who were slaves at that time. And because we were excluded from the Constitution when it was originally written, today they have to amend it in order to include us. But if you notice, the Civil War didn't include us in the Constitution. Had the Civil War included us in the Constitution, we would be citizens today. Had the amendments even to the Constitution actually included us, we would be citizens today. If the Supreme Court desegregation decision way back in 1954 was sufficient to include us into the jurisdiction of the Constitution, all of our problems would be solved today. So there's something about civil rights that makes it almost impossible for us to get it. So you have to know the difference between civil rights and human rights. As long as our people are begging for civil rights or they are labeling their struggle for freedom, justice, and equality under the label of civil rights, then what they do is leave us in the jurisdiction of Uncle Sam's courts. And it's actually Uncle Sam who is guilty of all of the violation of our rights that have taken place in this country. So when you go to Uncle Sam to try and get some kind of redress over civil rights violations, you're taking your case to the man who's responsible for the violation. So the only way our people can really get some meaningful results, it has to be taken out of Uncle Sam's hands and taken into a world court. And the world court that has been set up to listen to the complaints of human rights violations is in the United Nations. Human rights are international, and civil rights come within the jurisdiction of the countries where these rights are violated. Human rights come before civil rights.
That may be so, but the civil rights are an important factor.
You can never get civil rights until you have human rights. Human rights represent the right to be a human being. Whenever you are respected and recognized as a human being, your civil rights are automatic.
But if we get civil rights, we are human beings.
No, you have to get the recognition of human rights first. This is why people can come here from Africa and Asia and immediately are able to benefit from what the Constitution stands for, because they are recognized as a human being when they touch the shores of North America. But the black people in this country, all of our human characteristics were destroyed by slavery. Our language was destroyed. Our history was destroyed. Our culture was destroyed. And then the white man taught us that we were savages in the jungle and living at a subhuman level. And for this reason, when they put the Constitution together, they classified our people as 3/5 of a man, which meant subhuman, not a complete human being. And once our human characteristics were completely destroyed, this gave them justification for treating us like we were animals. And it also justified their selling us from plantation to plantation like you sell a horse and a cow and a bag of wheat. Why, George Washington himself historically is on record as having sold or having traded a black man for a keg of molasses, which shows you he didn't regard that black man as a human being. Well, if the black man's human rights had been respected, he never could have been a slave here in America. And if his human rights had been restored by the Emancipation Proclamation, automatically we would have been citizens right after the Civil War. So we must be regarded as human. Our human rights must be respected before we can ever be regarded as citizens and our civil rights be respected.
By working together as partners, the man on the European continent, he in cahoots with this white man on the American continent,
succeeded in taking over Africa and Asia and the entire world while we went to sleep. And then in 1865, he came up with a trick pretending that he was fighting a civil war to set us free, which he wasn't to set us free. He came up with another trick that he was issuing an Emancipation Proclamation to set us free, which it wasn't to set us free. And then he come up also pretending that he was putting some amendments to the Constitution to set us free, which it wasn't to set us free. And then later on he come up with a Supreme Court decision which he said was to give us free access to better education, which it wasn't to do that. And then last year he came up with a bill that he called also to give us more freedom, which it also wasn't to do that. Any man who will know the level of civilization that we started out on and came from, any man who knows the criminal deeds that was done to us by his people to bring us to the level that we've been on for the past 300 years is so deceptive, so deceitful, so criminally deceitful, that it is almost beyond his nature or desire to come up with anything meaningful that will undo what has been done to us over the past 300 years. It is absolutely necessary. Anything that is done for us has to be done by us.